I want to offer you this may be my best-selling book. For those of you who love Pentecostal history, church history, I wrote this book about 30 years ago. It took me 5 years traveling all over the country, 5 years to research this book, 6 including writing it itself. I think we've sold about 70,000 of these books. This book has gotten me in seminaries all over the world teaching about the phenomenon of Pentecost. This book has gotten me in Africa, in Europe, Asia, Russia, China. People, the word of God, Pentecost is spreading around the world. So I want you to have this book. I believe it will bless you. They tell me it's one of the greatest books on Pentecostalism that's ever been written.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Divine Report. And I'm your host, Brother Antoine, here once again. And I want to say that tonight we have a very, very special guest and looking forward to this interview here. Been trying to track down the bishop for time and got in touch with him. We have Bishop J. Laverne Tyson here on tonight, and I just thank God for allowing him to, find time in the schedule to be with us. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce himself, give a quick background as to who he is, and we're going to get right into it. So, Bishop Tyson, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, Brother Antoine. My heart is thrilled and encouraged by the vision that God has given to you. I like this.
Awesome.
Your bold motivations and your bold dreams and your bold ideas of how to perpetuate the gospel, promote the gospel through this ingenious means and method. I'm a radio TV guy. I've been on radio since my early 20s and have been on television for quite a while. I'm not on TV right now, but I love the communication technology that God has given to us. And I love how you're trying to incorporate it within the gospel. I'm J. Laverne Tyson. I'm the eldest son of Bishop James E. Tyson and Evelyn Hainsworth Tyson. There were 5 of us. Many of you know my brother, Bishop C. Sean Tyson. Many of you knew my other brother, Minister Lawrence Craig Tyson. I know this is going to sound subjective, the greatest organ player that ever lived. You know my brother Craig?
I actually seen some YouTube clips, I believe, of him playing. So yes. Yeah. He
was. Both my brothers are geniuses, and my sisters are geniuses too. They're just not as well known. I'm a PK, pastor's kid, grew up in the church. My wife and I have been pastoring for 44 years. We pastored the church I'm pastoring now in Warren, Ohio. We started 44 years ago. We pastored here 14 years before my father called me back to Indianapolis to work with him and to be his assistant pastor and youth leader. So we moved back to Indianapolis. I was with my dad 3 or 4 years, and the Lord moved us out. I started a work there called New Beginning Ministries. Pastored there for 14 years when my dad asked me to come back, and I succeeded. My father at Christ Church was there 4 years and ended up back in Warren, Ohio. That's a story in itself, but that's a general idea of who I am.
That's excellent. Thank you for starting out with that. So talk about, let's go back to the beginning. Talk about what it was like growing up in Youngstown, Ohio.
Things were not as, quote, bad as they are now. There were still nuclear families back then where there was a husband, father, mother, a homekeeper in the home. I grew up in the 50s, the greatest decade of all. Howdy Doody and Sky King and Disney, the wonderful world of Disney, a time of innocence. We came up in a very strict household. As far back as I can remember, the church is all I knew. We called it Old Mount Calvary, located at 390 Chicago Avenue. And we were members of the Mount Calvary Pentecostal Church, one of the most esteemed. More bishops. Let me show you the impact of this church. More bishops have come out of Mount Calvary Pentecostal Church than any church in the PAW, in the history of the PAW.
Wow.
Bishop Ray Robinson, Bishop James E. Tyson, Bishop Norman Wagner, Bishop Lundy, Bishop Franklin, Bishop Glenn Brady, Bishop Brantley, and several others. So, and some of the great musicians, my brother, Timothy Carpenter, Freddie Stevens, that church has been symbolic of developing, promoting great leaders. It was a wonderful time to be a pastor's kid.
That's excellent. Excellent. I wanted to ask you this. You said growing up in the 50s. And now I tend to ask people this a lot when they say they were born in the 50s, going into the 60s. Do you remember Jim Crow at all? Did you have to encounter that, or was that something that you were blessed not to have to face?
Where we lived geographically, Jim Crow wasn't as profound and as prolific as it was in the South. I grew up in Youngstown, Ohio. My father's first church was in Canton, Ohio. Then we moved to Leavenworth, Kansas. Then back to Youngstown. My father took over our home church. And then in 1971, my father was called the pastor of the Mother Church. We called the Mother Church Christ Temple in Indianapolis. And we've had a footprint there now going on 50 years. But no, as a kid, you're not as involved with racism, when you're 8, 9, 10 years old. To be honest with you, son, I never really encountered much Jim Crow in my life.
That's good. That's good. So with that being said, of course you talked about your siblings a little bit. What was it like growing up as a preacher's kid?
You're in the fishbowl. There were demands, unwarranted demands placed on me and my siblings because we were the pastor's kids. Because you are the pastor's kids, to a great extent, people expect you to be perfect. And you know what? And when my wife and I started having children, some of the demands I placed on my children, some of the demands that my father especially placed on me and my siblings, I started placing on my children. My expectations of them to be better, as far as their activities were concerned, their actions were concerned. Till one day, my son, his car was parked behind mine. I think it was 16 or 17 years old. When I turned the car off, I heard some of the most raucous rap music, every cuss word you could think of, and I was furious. Got out of the car, ran in the house, yelled up the steps, "Marlon, get down here." And the retort that came out of my mouth was, "What would the saints think if they heard this?" And my wife stepped up in my face, said, wait a minute. Our kids are no worse than any other kids. And that did something to me. And I we maintain a strict, godly environment in our house, but I wasn't hard on my kids like my father was to me, because they're just kids. Our kids are no different from any other kids.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And God, my kids have turned out, all of them, tremendous individual. My one son owns his own law firm. He has about 5 lawyers working for him. My daughter's a lawyer, and my son is a logistics manager at a large firm. So all of them are doing well.
That's a blessing.
And saved. Yeah,
that's a blessing right there. That's a blessing. With that being said, I do want to move forward, but I saw where you it was a clip at Christ Temple, and you were I think the message was, I forgot the address of the church, but you were talking about how you and your siblings, you all grew up, and your mom would play classical music and make you all listen to it, and you said you hated that. What was, I guess, what was the background behind her, doing that for you all? And did you ever come to like that kind of music at all?
Oh, absolutely. My mother was a profound woman, and I say that with all objectivity. My mother was a genius, seriously. My mother went to a college preparatory high school called the Rand School, which was probably 98% white. And my mother was only one of two students, Black students, to graduate on the National Honor Society. She was brilliant. And as kids, excellence was always perpetuated in our home from both my father and my mother. So my mother saw the intrinsic talents that we had, especially musically. So every Saturday we had to sit down in front of a high fidelity record player, and for an hour listen to classical music, Rachmaninoff and Beethoven, Bach, and you name it. Then every other Saturday she took us to the library. This is where I got my propensity for books, especially reference books. She would take us to the library every Saturday and say, go find something to read. And for 2 hours, we had to read something and come back and report to her what we read.
Wow.
So my mother drove us to excellence and nurtured each of our individual gifts.
Wow. So with that too, so on the flip side, what was Bishop James E. Tyson like as a father outside of the pulpit? Because I mean, of course, most people would know him for, being Bishop James E. Tyson, but what was he like as a father? And what was one of the most pivotal lessons that you learned from him as a son?
Work ethic. My father, when we were young, ain't no lazy men coming out of this house. My father, except for my grandfather, my father was the hardest working man that I've ever seen. He worked like a rented mule. That guy worked so. Before he started pastoring, he was a plastering contractor. He owned his own plastering contracting firm. My father would work 16, 17, 18 hours a day. So when we were young, my dad after school would have us go out and cut the grass with hand shears. Taught us how to work, our work ethic, and that whatever we did, it had to be done with excellence. My father taught us humility. My father was the greatest man that I have ever known. He and Bishop Wagner were my two mentors. Bishop Wagner was my brother-in-law, and my father were my two greatest influences in my life. But my father taught us how to work, how to love God, how to love God's people, manners, humility, contriteness. Those are the lessons that we learn. And my dad was the bravest man I've ever known. And when we have time, I'll tell you some of the things that he had to endure and encounter that only bravery in God got him through. He taught us how to pray.
Wow. That's powerful. Now, I wanted to also bring this up before I move to the next point. You also talked about how I believe you and your brothers had went to him at one point and said, we're going to talk to Dad. He's putting all this money into the church and so forth and so on. And
how you know all this stuff?
So actually, I had seen this. You were talking about this at Christ Temple before you had ministered the word, and you had made a point about his response to you all and how that made you all feel. Can you tell the people about that experience?
Sure. My father, can we just be honest?
Absolutely.
My father could raise, Bishop Wagner and my father could raise more money than any men I've ever seen. But my dad, millions and millions and millions of dollars went through my father's hands. And I've seen it with my own, with own sight, millions. And my father put 95% of all the money that he raised or earned back into the church. My father educated, I don't know how many teenagers, put them through, but made us pay our way.
Wow.
My father spent hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars pouring it back into the church, but made us pay for our own car. So one day, my father gave a huge amount of money to one of the young men who were our antagonists, and we had enough. So we called a family meeting over at my dad's house. We were furious and just angry to the hilt. Dad, you spent all this money pouring people, educating people, buying them cars, helping them with their mortgages. And what have you done for us? And my dad, he recognized what we said was true. He bent his head down And I thought he was getting ready to cry. He said, you're right. If I had to do it over again, I would. He said, I haven't left you any stocks, bonds, or debentures. He said, but I've left you a good name. And when he said that, it just diffused our argument. And I never forgot that. He said, I haven't been able to pour into you and leave you an inheritance like I should have, but I've left you a good name.
Wow. Wow.
And everywhere I've traveled all around the world, and people know our name by virtue of our dad. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. I thought that was very profound when you shared that. I said, wow, that hit me a little different as well.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
And
So
my good name has gotten me into circles and places than more than any amount of money could do.
That's a blessing. That's a blessing. So let me ask you this, Bishop Tyson. When did ministry begin for you? Especially being a preacher's kid, at what point, what's the earliest memory that you have that you can say, okay, I can pinpoint when the Lord began to deal with me concerning ministry?
When we were living in a shack at 12 Wallace Street in Youngstown, we were very, very poor. This is when my father was trying to operate his plastering business. I knew I was called to preach probably at 7 or 8. Doctors beget doctors, lawyers beget lawyers, and it's biblical, priests beget priests. So I knew when I was 7 or 8, I was called to preach. When I was 13, 14, or 15, I felt the Lord dealing with me to pastor. Now I told the Lord, I would be willing to preach for you. You can keep that pastor stuff, because I saw how my dad and mom were just getting beat up. I knew what pastors go through. So at 7 and 8, on Saturday mornings, I would get my robe and put it around me, get my Bible and my scarf, my handkerchief, stand there and preach the hell out of my brothers and sisters. But it was about 18 or 19 when I started running from ministry. I wanted to be a lawyer. I always wanted to be a pilot. I don't know where that proclivity came from. And I eventually did become a pilot. But I was running from God until I couldn't run anymore. So about 18 is I told the Lord, I'm yours. Yeah.
Wow. That's great. That's great. Now, you talked about earlier how your mom took you all to the library and you all had to report back as to what you read about. When did your love for information and your love for research, when did that manifest? At what point did you say, I'm going to write me a book? And what was the first book that you did write and put together?
I remember at Old Mount Calvary again, I was probably around 10 or 11 years old. Deacon Enoch Whipple was standing in a crowd of about 5 or 6 other people, members of the church. And I just happened to overhear him. And this name came out of his mouth, Bishop G.T. Haywood. And son, I cannot tell you how just hearing that name, a spirit jumped on me. And he told me when he was young, he had visited Bishop Haywood in the 20s and the early 30s when he had his church conventions. And so I listened to him talk about Bishop Haywood and how profound he was. I cannot tell you how and why that conversation grabbed me. I didn't do anything about it then, but something always stirred in me. My mom taking me to the library. I love reference books with pictures and captions. That captivated me. But then God began to put it together. My love for history, my love for church history generally, my love for Pentecostal history specifically, just did something to me. My first book was Before I Sleep. And in fact, it was the biography of Bishop G.T. Haywood.
Awesome. So I actually have that here with me right here.
There you go.
Yes. So let's talk about the book a little bit. What was the first reference point in terms of how you were going to get any information concerning Bishop Haywood outside of stuff that possibly was already on record?
Right. most authors will tell you, I wrote a book called The Early Pentecostal Revival. It took me almost 6 years to write, but 5.5 of those years were research, traveling all over the countries, attics and basements and archives. And, I could have wrote that book in 6 months, but the research. And Before I Sleep was my first book. I had mentioned to you that I had the privilege of sitting down many times with his daughter, Fannie Haywood Ellis. People back then had class on, that group from the early 1900s up until the 60s, they had class. They may not have, many of them were not educated, but they had a distinction about them. Class, a work ethic. This crew today won't work in a pie factory, putting cherries on pie. They were hard workers and visionaries, owned land, and had this woman, Bishop Haywood, was so far ahead of his time. This guy in the 20s was negotiating to buy an airplane. He traveled all over the country. Bishop Haywood was so beloved and so well known. His travel schedule was just incredible. And back then it was either by car or by train. But he traveled so much, he was negotiating to buy, I forgot what the plane was, but an airplane, number one. He was negotiating with CBS to go nationwide on their radio network.
Wow.
So, Bishop, Sister Fannie Haywood Ellis was so profound, a woman of class, distinction, brilliant. The words that evoked out of her mouth, you could just tell this woman was polished. And I mentioned to you, Bishop Haywood was so far ahead of his time. He sent Sister Fannie Haywood to New York City to a finishing school to finish her last 3 years of high school. He valued education that much, but he wasn't able to advance the organization commensurate with his anointing, his education, and his skill, because we weren't ready for that then.
With that being said, when you did meet his daughter, for one, like, how did you get in contact with her during that time? And also, was that an overwhelming experience being able to sit and talk with her?
Oh, man. Well, my father was pastoring Christ Temple at the time, where Bishop Haywood was the first pastor. Well, he was the second pastor there. A lot of people think he was the founder, but he wasn't. So Sister Fannie, she was in her 80s when I first started meeting with her. And so she was still a member of the church. She was old and she couldn't come out that much, but I would go to her house, sit on the front porch of her home, and we would spend 2 or 3 hours at a time just talking and hearing the experience. Man, I'm telling you, hearing the experiences of her father, the early Pentecostal church at that day, what serving the Lord was like back then was just life altering. It was cathartic hearing and listening to her speak.
Wow. So with that being said, is there anything in the book itself that you didn't or you weren't able to put into the book, maybe because too personal, or possibly it was something that you wanted to keep as a jewel to yourself? Or did you kind of exhaust everything as far as the information you got from her?
Yes. But, Bishop Haywood died at 50 years old, 50 years of age.
He was young. Wow.
So I asked Sister Fannie, why did your father die so young? She thought for a moment and she said 2 words, the brethren. And I said, what do you mean by that? She said, the brethren killed my dad. Jealousy, because he was 50 years ahead of them. A lot of them fought him because they thought he was unspiritual. That shocked me. And then some other things that I want to warrant her confidence in me. I just can't say right now.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. That's totally fine. Also, I know you had stated in your research of some of the early church fathers and some of the intricate people who pretty much advanced, I guess, the apostolic message in the modern time. You stated that you had found some things out about them that discouraged you. And not that not that you have to speak on any of those things, but was there anything that, I guess, what about it made you say, I don't want to finish this book? Was it not putting the information out there, or was it just something that you just couldn't take?
Well, yes, I put that book down for about a year. I learned that all flesh is grass. And in my research, I learned some of our greatest leaders had children out of wedlock when they were pastoring, had embezzled money while they were pastoring, had mistresses on the side while they were some of our, if I wouldn't mention names, you probably fall out of your chair. But because of, I guess, contriteness and confession, God didn't kill them or destroy them and allowed them to stand, I learned that lesson that all flesh is grass. When I started hearing some of this stuff, I was so disillusioned. I was disillusioned. Not this bishop. I know not this bishop. But it taught me a lesson. All flesh is grass, man.
Wow. Wow. That's powerful. That's powerful. Before I move forward, I wanted to ask as well, by any chance, do you have any, I guess, transcripts or audio or video of you and Bishop Haywood's daughter at all? Or was that just a kind of like a quick exchange just for the book to be on record?
That shows you how fallible and foolish and ridiculously stupid I am. That not once, I had many interviews with her, but not one time did I tape one of those interviews. Every time I think about it, you would have to bring that up.
I know
one of my greatest embarrassments and greatest mistakes. Yep.
Now the things happen as you stated. I think it's a blessing that the book, it has been written to where we can see some of the information that you did, gather. Also, you wrote this one, the early contenders of, the early contenders for the faith. Now, I know these were essays that wasn't published at the time that you published the book. How intense was the research with getting some of these things? Was this something that you were, was it easily acquirable, or was this something that you had to really dig for?
Well, some of the older saints, the Christian Outlook. Are you familiar with the Christian Outlook?
Yes.
Okay. Most of the major Pentecostal groups, Church of God of Christ, Church of God, Pentecostal Assemblies of the World, Church of our Lord Jesus Christ, most of them had a magazine that they published every month. And a lot of these essays from some of the great stalwarts in Pentecost in the teens, 20s, and 30s were written in the Christian Outlook. So in my research, a lot of these essays came out of those Christian outlooks. They were published in the Christian Outlook, but never seen anymore.
Wow.
And are you familiar with Bishop Ross Paddock? You
yes.
Probably not.
Yes. Yes, okay. Sir. Yes, sir.
Out of Michigan.
Yes.
He was one of the presiding bishops of the Pentecostal Assemblies of the World. He was a white brother. I traveled to, he was in not Kellogg, Wisconsin. He was he was one of the cities in Michigan.
It was Kalamazoo, I believe.
Kalamazoo.
Yeah.
Yeah. I took my two sons to Kalamazoo, spent all day with him. I took a lot of pictures up there to have him. I would say, Bishop, who is this? And some of those real long pictures that you've seen, I would have him identify who these people were. And then I looked down and happened to notice he had this cabinet full of Christian outlooks. The very first one to the last issue that month, there were about 500 or 600 of them, going all the way back to 1921.
Wow.
And I said, what are those, Bishop? He says, those are every Christian outlook ever published. So I started pulling some out. I think it was my greatest archival find.
Wow.
I said, Bishop, would there be any way that I could come up here every now and then and spend my couple of days going through these? He said, go on and take them.
Wow.
He said,
wow.
Go on and take them. It's incredible, man.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I want to move forward. One more question as it pertains to this subject. What would be some advice or some instruction you would give to someone within the apostolic faith who is an aspiring writer or an aspiring researcher, but don't know where to get started or don't know exactly, don't have any, I guess, connections as to write a book or to gather information to preserve history for this new generation? What would you tell them, or how would you direct them?
Start where you are. If you're great authors are driven by a passion for words, and then depending on the subject matter that you're writing about, that will add credence and another layer to your passion. For me, my passion was driven by history, by the lives of great men and great women. I'm working on a book now about the great women. It's going to be probably 2 or 3 part. Like part 1, part 2, part 3. The women of Pentecost who were responsible for the growth of Pentecost. I would say, determine what your passion is. Okay. Hone your skills, even if it means going to journalistic school. Start where you are. Write something, do something, write something. Study the lives of authors whose mantle may fall upon you, or whose mantle you're to receive and to carry on. But you hone your skill by doing your skill. The more you do it, I look at before I sleep. If I would do it over, I would make so many changes to it. It wasn't edited correctly in some respects. I would do it completely different, and I might. Start where you are. Determine what your passion is, and don't stop. The hardest part of writing the book is starting it and finishing it. That's the hardest part, is starting it and finishing it.
Not the research.
Well, that's second.
That's second.
Second is not necessarily hard, but it's time consuming. And see, a book has to be honest. You got to be honest in your deliberation, especially if you're dealing with historical situations. The book has got to be honest. And so research to me is fun. It's not work. I love going in basements, digging out stuff,
Oh, yeah.
But the key is get started. The more you do it, the better you become at it.
That's good stuff. Good stuff. How did you get the nickname the Flying Preacher and also the Dreamer?
In my family, I'm the oldest of 5. And again, I don't know where this came from. Man, I was a big dreamer. And even when we lived in the ghetto, and again, I don't know where this proclivity came from. I always wanted to be a pilot. Always. I don't know where it came from. So when I was a junior in high school, we were living in Leavenworth, Kansas, and the general, who is the commandant of Fort Leavenworth, God gave me favor with him. I worked in the post exchange as a cashier. So God gave him favor with me. He said, Jim, he says, you have the quality, because I was real involved in high school. I was state debate champion.
Wow.
I was really involved. I was the business education clubs of Kansas president. I was the national vice president of the distributive education club. So I was real involved in high school. He heard about me, and he said, how would you like to go to West Point? And my ears picked up. And I said, I would love to, but the only reason I wanted to go, I thought it would be the opportunity for me to learn how to fly airplanes. So to make a long story short, you have to be recommended by your congressman. I was recommended by my congressman. I was going to West Point after I graduated my senior year, and I got sick. I contracted a kidney disease, and I couldn't go because of I couldn't do the exercise, you know. So 20 years passed. I drove by an airport. I saw a sign, to learn how to fly. And I drove in and I said, I want to sign up today to go to flight school. Went to flight school, graduated second in my class.
Wow.
And learned how to fly airplanes.
Wow. Look at that. Look at that. That's amazing there. What was the transition like, or let me ask, well, being a pastor and being an author as well, how did you balance, you know, did you set writing or researching aside when you were pastoring, or was that something that you sort of did altogether?
Both. In becoming the pastor of the church where I'm at now, most of my time I had to devote to transition, getting the church off the ground, becoming acclimated with the saints or what have you. Then when I went to Indianapolis to work with my father, become his assistant, again, I set the work aside. And so depending on where I was in my ministry, oftentimes I had to put the work aside. But after things kind of settled down, I try to integrate both pastoring and if I had like an hour or two that I could spend writing, that's what I did.
Oh, that's good. That's good. That's good. Also, you talked about, so now that you're a retired pastor, I thought was a very interesting, being a pastor's pastor, and you counseling other pastors and giving instruction to other pastors. What is the difference that you found in your experience between pastoring pastors and pastoring a congregation?
Well, of course, there's a distinct difference. You had two different demographics, of course. You're dealing with, when you're pastoring pastors, you're dealing with leaders, of course, who have some kind of recognition of what pastoring is all about. So your approach to leadership is different because you're dealing again with two different distinct demographics. Of course, with pastoring people, you're dealing with sheep. And when you're dealing with pastor, you're dealing with pastor who pastoring sheep. So I think it was the adjustment of trying to be as successful as you could be with each. I started a fellowship in Indianapolis called the World Fellowship of Independent Ministries. And I gave that up. I turned it over to my assistant about a year ago because when I came to, I've been back in Warren for 17 months now, and the workload is too much for me here to have kept leadership of that fellowship. So I turned it over to him. But the adjustment of dealing with each demographic was probably the most difficult thing. And we pastored pastors across the world. The Lord has blessed me. Those books have got me in 50 countries around the world.
Wow.
Teaching about Pentecost. And so I did that for about 8 years, traveling around the world, teaching, training, mentoring pastors until the Lord called us back here.
In terms of you authoring all of these books, how has the information that you found, how has that enhanced you as a pastor, or how has that enhanced your spiritual life, finding out some of these miraculous things that you found?
Well, people are the same everywhere. It broadened my perspective on where people are at any given time and situation. For instance, we pastored and they drank wine, had their breakfast, what have you, because we're taught don't drink wine.
Right.
But those people people as spiritual as I was. It gave me a broad perspective of where people are logistically, strategically, tactically. It gave me a broad view that without God, we can do nothing.
Mm.
Without God, we can do nothing. And how I learned, I was in China ministering at some seminaries there. And the depth, the breadth, and length of people's devotion to God across the oceans is mind-boggling.
Wow.
You know, we think in America, we're it, but we're really not.
Mm.
We may be it as far in terms of having buildings and money and TV, but when it comes to devotion and commitment, we're way down at the bottom, Doc.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, you know, what worked in what Bishop Haywood works now, if you're willing to spend the time praying and working like he did. Yeah.
Wow. Now that's good. That's good. I want to ask you a few more questions before I let you go, Bishop.
Sure.
One of them being just thinking about your early start in ministry, of course, becoming an author and a pastor. Was there ever a time in your ministry you felt nervous or apprehensive because your father was a pastor or anything of that sort? Or was it other things that possibly caused you to maybe second guess at one point coming along?
Sure. Trying to live up to my father's name and his reputation was always difficult. When I took over Christ Church, are you familiar with Christ Church?
A little bit, not too much. Okay.
Well, that's my father pastored Christ Temple for 5 years. Then he founded Christ Church.
Okay.
And when I succeeded my father, about 50, 75 members left the first week. These were people who loved me. They really loved me. Who charter members, you know, some of the most solid people, they left me. And they came, you know, my nickname is Verne. Verne, we have nothing against you. We think you're a tremendous young man, but you're not your dad. And they left. And there was this progression of people. We probably lost 150, 200 people in the first year of my pastorate there because I wasn't my dad. So, you know, you have to learn how to stand on your own 2 feet. God has for you he wants to sit up under you. I got very discouraged in ministry. There were times when I quit every Monday. I just couldn't do it no more. I told people I wouldn't choose to be a pastor. I know God called me to be a pastor, but I wouldn't choose to be one. With the responsibilities, the discouragement, the heartache, the pain. I love God's people. I would be happy just being a good usher. So, you know, I had to learn my father. In fact, one time I was getting ready to resign my church here. The saints were beating me like a rented mule.
Wow.
And this just went on and on. The more I did, the more they were talking about me. So I drove to Indianapolis to tell my dad I was resigning and I wanted to come back home to Indianapolis to serve him. We were sitting at Denny's. I remember just like it was yesterday, just like 25, 30 years ago. He was sitting eating a bowl of vegetable soup and I'm crying. I can't take it no more. Sad, I'm quitting. And my dad just listened to me and didn't say a word. Didn't say a word except wiped his mouth with his napkin, put his soup spoon down, got up to leave. He looked me in the eye and he said, "Stick with it." And got up and walked out. Stick with it.
Wow.
And I learned, and I tell pastors today who go through what I was going through then, stick with it.
Wow.
Yeah. You know, all of us are afraid of something, son. I've been pastoring 44 years. And, you know, I taught a lesson this past Wednesday about insecurities. I have a lot of insecurity complexes. And one of those is measuring up to what two people think that I am. That's always been a problem with me and challenged with me. I'm still being challenged with that now. You know? Wow.
Wow. That's good. That's good. With that being said, final 2 questions for you, Bishop. For young ministers of this generation and for young ministers aspiring to be pastors, bishops, so forth and so on. What are some misconceptions that you, in your experience, that you've seen young ministers have, and what's something that you would say to them to sort of steer them in the right direction?
Mhm. Be who you are. Capitalize and concentrate on your skills. The men who had the most impact on me were the most humble men. In our culture, unless you can get a crowd up on their feet and bring the house down, you really can't preach. And that shows you something about how shallow we can be. And so a lot of times young ministers will act out of themselves in order to impress people. I encourage pastors, be who you are. If you're not a hooper, teach expositorily. Be who you are. Teaching is what people need today. I'd rather have 10 teachers than 10 preachers. I keep trying to tell young pastors, humility is one of the most powerful agents and instruments a preacher can have. In our culture, we're taught to captivate an audience. You have to be, how we are. You got to be self-confident, and you do. You have to be, I command the pulpit. And I've said to people, many, if not most of us, would never go to church if Jesus was the pastor today. He hung with poor folk. He wore the same tunic last year. He didn't dress, he didn't wear Brioni suits and what have you. His humility would have been, to a great extent, coined as meek or weak. Many of us would have never gone to Christ Church if he was a pastor today. He didn't have it. He wasn't charismatic enough. He couldn't move me. All he did was teach. But he's our perfect example. I tell preachers today, you want to be, quote, great, be like Jesus.
That's it. Final question for you, Bishop. With all that you've experienced up until this point, from being 8 and 9, knowing that you were called, and traveling to 50 states,
50 countries,
50 countries, up until this point, what would you say to your younger self, if you could, anything to your younger self from where you are today?
I would have told myself, whatever God has for me, he has for me. I wouldn't have striven so much to be a bishop, because I felt if I could, it was my goal to be presiding bishop. And, if I had stayed at Christ Church and played the game, and I say this with all self-deprecation, I probably could have been with my name. If I had worked it like I knew how to work it,
yes,
I probably could have been presiding bishop. And I say this with a degree of shame and embarrassment. I've always loved God, always wanted to do God's bidding and God's work, but I wanted to be presiding bishop because of the esteem that it would bring me. I would tell people today, young people today, that greatness, what impresses men, doesn't impress God. And the greatest leaders in the Bible, the greatest patriarchs in the Bible, were men of humility, prayer, commitment, and dedication. God will make your name great more than any man can. That's what I would tell him. That way you can concentrate on pleasing God instead of trying to be somebody.
Absolutely.
And a lot of times our young ministers, that's what they aim for. I know, because I used to be that way. You got in my way. If you would get in my way on my quest to be a bishop, I'd walk over you. If I played the game, I'm going to tell you this. I don't know if you have any time. My father was pastor
yes, sir.
Christ Temple. And I was probably around 25 or 26 then. I was my father's adjutant and his assistant. And we were having the midwinter bishop meeting at our church, and they were in a meeting. There must have been, I guess, 80, 90, 100 bishops from around the world. And I was waiting for them to get out of the meeting so I could share with them where to go next. So the meeting ended, and one of our bishops that I admired greatly, I still do. He's gone on to be with the Lord now. I wanted to be like him. So he came over to me and he said, "Bernie, my name, Bernie, come here." He put his arm around me. And God had given me favor with this man. "I'm gonna tell you something that if you follow me, you gonna go play." I said, "What is it, Bishop?" He said, "You gotta look like somebody, talk like somebody, dress like somebody, have you some money like somebody, drive you a car like somebody, to be somebody." That spirit jumped on me, Doc. And I don't want to, that spirit jumped on me. And from that day forward, that was my credo. And that's how I tried to live. One day, God said to me, "I don't like you no more." And when I was 47 years old, you got a minute?
Yes, sir. Oh, absolutely. Yes, sir.
I was sitting next to my dad at Christ Church. There must have been 1,000, 1,200 people in there. My brother Craig and Sean were on the organ. Man, we had 60, 70 people in the choir. Choir was cranking. I looked out the window and saw that 80 acres of land that we had bought a country club. Saw that 80 acres out there. And these words came out of my mouth. It came out of my mind. I said, one day, all of this is going to be mine. And just like I'm talking to you, the Lord said to me, "What did you say?" And like a fool, I said it again. One day, I looked at all them people, that choir, we taking in $50,000, $60,000, $80,000 a week. One day, all of this is going to be mine. And a week later, my father called me in his office and fired me.
Whoa.
And we were going through, my stepmother and I, we just kept bumping heads. And for some reason, she was fearful of me. So my dad couldn't take it no more. He was caught in the middle. And God used that woman to help save me. My dad fired me. And for 3.5 years, I delivered pizzas for Papa John Pizza. I was 47 years old.
Wow.
It was the best thing that ever happened to me. God humbled me and showed me I can use you, but I don't need you.
Wow. That's powerful. Seriously, that is very powerful. I wish we can go on and on, Bishop Tyson. I truly enjoyed you being with us on tonight. Enjoyed the insight that you gave, and it was a blessing to talk about some of the books that you wrote, and some of the experiences you had. Before we close out tonight, is there any final words that you have for us?
I want to say, first of all, I want to commend you. I love what you're doing, and anything I can do to help you advance the kingdom through the medium that God has given to you, I'm here to help you. Whatever you do, keep your vision and your dream ahead of you, in front of you. And there's no telling how this is going to lead, what it's going to lead to. And I love what you're doing. And the last thing I would say, that we are on an assignment, that God has thoughts of us, thoughts of good and not of evil, to give us an expected end. Be faithful to God. Your anointing will come through prayer. Great churches and great ministries are built on their knees. I had to learn that the hard way. Great ministries and great churches are built on people's knees. Love God, love his people. Be faithful to the assignment that God has given to you. And whatever your desires are and your goals and dreams, God will fulfill those if you put him first, seek the kingdom of God, and stay in your lane. I promise you, God will make your name great throughout the earth.
Powerful. I want to say thank you again, Bishop Tyson. Thank you for those kind words. And to those that are watching, God bless you all. We pray that you were blessed by this interview. And until next time, you all enjoy the rest of your weekend, and God bless.
God bless you too, son. Stay the course.
This is the Divine Report. We want to say thank you for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button down below. along with the notification bell so that you won't miss any of our newest uploads. We'll have more interviews, panel discussions, along with more biblical discussions. Also, don't forget to check us out on Facebook, which is also the Divine Report, along with Instagram, so that way you can get our latest updates along with any other content that we do post. Again, we do thank you for tuning in, and God bless.
Jesus, 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 there's something about that name.